Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. So my name is Kevin Murray. I am a delivery director at Valtech. I've got a lot of experience of working in public sector, and today I'm joined by my colleague.
I'm Clifton Green, a senior UX consultant at Valtech, and I've recently been working with the VLA on the personalised registrations and vehicle management exemplar. So
today we'd like to present our topic of lean UX and agile development in the public sector. Myself and Clifton have worked on a number of central government and health projects, and we want to show how lean UX and agile is at the heart of these deliveries. They're not just about software craftsmanship and good solid software engineering techniques. We'd like to take the time to show you the techniques that we've been using on these exemplars. So before we start, I'd actually like to set the scene by playing two very brief videos, so please bear with us. They are important to set the scene for our presentation.
Carers allowance is a benefit that's provided to people who are really deserving in society. These are people who are looking after friends and family that are very ill, in some cases terminally ill, and it's providing them with an income to help support the cost of caring for that individual. When having to deal with all these problems and all the other strife that's going on in their lives, being able to claim carers allowance should be the least of their worries.
The new service is to enable people to claim carers allowance online, which is a much quicker and easier process than using the paper form.
We've been able to remove 170 questions from the process, that's 49%. And we've done that because we've challenged the way that the policy's been interpreted on the claim form.
Make sure that the customer can understand and progress through the claim, giving us the right information to make a quick decision on their application.
We've simplified things and cut things back to just the bare information that customers need, and we've done that via our user testing and research.
The service would not be up and running without the user research, and to make sure that the participants, the carers' voice is at the heart of everything that we do. We've had people, less confident users, who by the time they get from the start of the claim through to the end, you can see them, they say this, that's so much better than I expected. I could go away and do that on my own now. It's been so good.
As carers are busy people, and these are some of the most vulnerable people in society, so if we're supporting them by providing a really easy method of claiming carers allowance, then that to me has got to be a good thing, because that's what we're here to do.
So carers allowance has been quite a significant success. It is one of the first exemplars to go live, and as you can see, it's all about helping vulnerable people. When we started off with the MVP, the idea was to put the paper claim live. It had over about 350 questions on there. The actual duration to get through was an hour and 20 minutes. Now we've got that down to about 20 minutes, but only because of the next video, which was extremely pivotal in the carers allowance project. The next video, I must warn you, it is very contrasting to the utopia you see there. It is a little bit upsetting, but it is so important, and it made such a difference to the project.
Carers don't recognise that they're carers. 2.
Nope, sorry.
Carers don't recognise that they're carers. 2. They don't always claim what they're entitled for. And 3. It's hard to get carers to understand that respite care is there for them to take to help them with their caring needs so they get a break. Here what you're saying is, yeah, we want to know when you go on your breaks, right? And that implies that when you have a break, or your child's in respite care, or even if you're sick and you're in hospital, your finances are going to be messed up because carers allowance is going to stop. And carers allowance is part of my monthly, weekly budget. And this is just, you're saying to carers, don't take respite care, you could get reduced funding. It's like, have you had a break? Have you had any breaks in caring since the 6 months before you're applying for? Well, does that mean I get direct payments for my son? And I do get breaks, I organise it and I get breaks, so what do I put down here? I have been in hospital for surgery, so do I put yes, do I put no? I go in surgery twice a year. I have respite care to support my son over that period. This is making me want to cry. So what do I put here? And it really is making me want to cry. Because if I put no, I'm lying because I've been in hospital, my son's been in hospital. If I put yeah, that means I'm going to not, it's telling me that I might not get it. And I know it's not real, but just the thought of it's just making me feel sick.
When my daughter goes into respite, the amount of tablets and oxygen
So, I won't play the rest of them, but we have a number of videos where people are getting visibly upset, starting to cry at some software screens that you built. It was, we were actually starting to build and do the analysis on these screens based on the paper claim form, and we were actually quite worried about the impact that this would have on the users. The paper claim form had no measurable way of getting feedback, so for us it was very important. Those videos, the second one's a bit more upsetting. They're with real users after just 2 sprints, but it was so important that we got the using lean UX techniques. We were able to build the hypothesis around how upsetting these questions would be and how the users would not be able to complete the claim form. So these are some of the most vulnerable people in society. So the purpose of playing those 2 videos is just to show the impact and the importance of the techniques that we're going to discuss today. So in sort of fitting with the theme of the conference, Clifton and I have taken a test-first approach to our presentation. First time I've done this. We wrote down our expected exit criteria first. So today we're going to try and get across the basic principles of lean UX. There's a fantastic technique called assumption mapping. We want to show you how to facilitate this, make sure it's understood. Clifton's going to go into detail about the importance of how you address simple, lightweight designs, make sure they're collaborative, and how important low-fidelity prototyping is. We want to talk about some user research techniques, but also we want to demonstrate and give an interactive example of affinity sorting. So at the heart of our approach and at the heart of lean UX is the ability to build, measure, learn and repeat. So today we're going to go through and give you techniques of how you can approach those different phases. And when you repeat, it's not just diving into the next phase. It's all about pause, reflect and decide, and make sure that you've got the right structure and process, especially if you're working in 1-week iterations in a discovery phase. You're moving fast, it's very intense. You've got to make sure there's some structure and process around what you're doing. So the first technique I want to describe today is assumption mapping. Now, assumption mapping is a fantastic technique to begin with when you're not sure where to start. So this is ideal at the start of an inception or a discovery phase. You get all the stakeholders in the room and you get everybody to write down the assumptions and place them on the quadrant with risk and impact. So high risk, high impact. You want to focus on the assumptions at the top right-hand quadrant. What we found is, this is from Jeff Gottel's Lean UX book, and it obviously is very powerful and helpful for lean startup, but for public sector projects we found that this didn't work, particularly if you've got an SRO in the room, if you've got security stakeholders in the room. You know, you're trying to get a broader range of people as possible, but risk seems to sort of be less available for discussion, as does impact. So on a number of projects we've changed the axes to uncertainty and proximity, and this makes it much more inclusive. It's all about making sure that people have a discussion around each assumption. And what you find is, you know, if people start having an argument or a structured discussion around whether something's certain or not, then actually it becomes very uncertain. Proximity is important as well, because we're going to be promoting Agile, we're going to be promoting continuous delivery, continuous integration. So we want to make sure people fully understand that this isn't a phase 1 release with a mythical phase 2 that might not happen. We want to make sure that people understand that there's going to be a sequence to the proximity, and we will progress through all of the assumptions. So to give a little bit of context, I'm going to show you a real example from the work we did with NHS Choices. So I need to set a little bit of context. NHS Choices is one of the busiest websites in Europe. It gets 50 million unique hits a week, and it has vanity metrics to die for. But what I love about the NHS Choices team is they know that their site does not meet user needs. So we did a discovery of how we can improve and transform NHS Choices. To give an example, can I get a show of hands, please? Can you put your hands up if you've had the varicella zoster virus? So maybe people that can speak Latin or Italian might understand that. But this is indicative with the problem of NHS Choices. So if you've got a 4-year-old child who you think actually has chickenpox, they've got a rash, they've got a temperature, one of the first things that you see is the Latin name for chickenpox. It's probably some of the most unhelpful information. Then the rest of the content is all about clinical defensibility rather than actually trying to help the people who are looking for assistance. Particularly when this isn't just about user needs, this is about user needs state, where people are in state of panic, fear, anxiety. They want to know, is it meningitis, chickenpox, but you get sort of hit with the Latin name first. So when we did our first assumption mapping exercise, you can see that a lot of the assumptions are in the top right-hand quadrant, and probably that's where, when you repeat this exercise, where a lot of them go. But to put it into context, I've highlighted a few of the assumptions in the different quadrants. So down here we have an assumption that's actually quite certain, fairly important in terms of proximity. Can't really make it out, but it says people are worried about being in contact with chickenpox when pregnant. Now we've got the analytics, we've got the page hits, we've got separate information about chickenpox and pregnancy, so we do know that's quite certain, but it's still important. On the far left-hand side, we've got the assumption that people want to know about chickenpox vaccinations. Well, that is actually very, very uncertain. We don't know if people want to know about chickenpox vaccinations. But what we do know is the NHS England advice is it's much safer in later life to get the full virus naturally rather than a vaccination, as it helps you with combat adult chickenpox and shingles. So, that is not important at the moment. That might change, but at the moment, it's not important. What we do have in the top right-hand corner is an assumption that people are looking for healthcare advice. Now, we don't actually know whether people are looking for that at all. What we do know is it's very important, because a lot of people are bringing their highly infectious children into GP surgery waiting rooms, which are full of elderly, vulnerable people with dodgy immune systems, which is not the best place for children to be with chickenpox. So what we have built is a number of assumptions around self-care advice to see if we could test that and prove that with user research. So assumption mapping is very powerful to begin with. So some tips for the facilitation. You want to make it as inclusive as possible. So give the audience just 5 minutes to work individually on post-it notes and write down some assumptions. Just keep one assumption per post-it note, or you find that when people put a few on a post-it note, you have to split them later on. Make it clear that there's no such thing as a wrong assumption. It's just maybe less relevant or more certain, and we don't need to address it. Give people the advice of, make sure the assumption fits in with the we assume that and then the fact, just so it becomes clear. And when you're in your multidisciplinary team, make sure, get everyone to stand up at the board at the quadrant, and comparatively, with the consensus of the group, comparatively start ordering the assumptions against the other assumptions. You may find that you might need to do a couple of iterations of this the first time. People get inspiration, you might change your ideas, but also revisit this exercise every sprint, especially during a discovery or inception phase. And what it actually does is, at this point, you've actually got a prioritized backlog after day one of assumptions of what you want to address, working, can't reach that high, working from the top right-hand corner down the way. You've got an order of assumptions that you want to know more information about. Once you've got your assumptions, it's always good to put them in the structure of the hypothesis. And the hypothesis, it just gives a little bit of process, a little bit of structure. You're making sure that you've got the condition, the feature, who it's for, and then some test criteria. Has anybody actually used assumptions before? Cool. So assumptions are very similar to a user story. Really, an assumption is just a user story that hasn't gone into production, it hasn't been built yet. But just giving that structure, that rigor around your assumptions, particularly when you're going into testing, it really helps with, they're very similar in terms of condition, who they're for, and the test criteria. So a very quick example of one of our real assumptions was during the NHS choices, we believed that providing a much better method of visual identification for chickenpox will help parents. It will give them an easier way to successfully validate that their child has chickenpox. And we tested this we actually did varying degrees of fidelity of prototypes of pictures identifying what chickenpox looked like. And what we found, that there's no single one image that helps people understand chickenpox. You have to take into account the skin colour, skin tone selector, but also the different stages of chickenpox. It does look very different on different children, but also we understood that we tried different images, and when the image was far too extreme, it put people off. And that allowed us to get enough information just off paper prototypes to actually go and build a real interactive prototype successfully.
And that kind of leads into where I come in. And something that I see time and time again is designers spending hours doing pixel perfect designs under the misconception that they need to give an accurate representation of how they envisage the end product to look. But without fulfilling a variety of UX practices and a user research plan, how can it be even remotely possible that anyone on the team knows what the end product is actually going to look like? The end goal is to release a product, and the sooner you can get to that, users won't need comps, mock-ups, or even the wireframes, as they'll actually be interacting with the real thing. So how can we lighten the load? So we can encourage designers, UI guys, UX to discuss wireframes in progress with the team and stakeholders. They'll get valuable information back from them, and a lot sooner, and save time. And with cooperative design, you can work with developers, the QA testers and BAs, and get them involved in the design. And that allows the whole team to share ownership and internalize the annotations. When this happens, we can review the simplest of sketches as wireframes, because everyone already understands the interactions, which leads into another method that can easily be adopted to get your teams collaborating more and discussing openly about the future design development, which is low fidelity designs when catch up. Sorry. Low fidelity prototyping can be really useful because it serves a dual purpose. They get you to the design validation, i.e. usability testing, and gets you there sooner. But they also demonstrate the interactions, removing the need to write wire annotations, as the user can see the interaction firsthand. Lo-fi prototyping also means that if you have a creative designer, a UI, or a UX, there's no reason for any blockers in your process, and it aids an iterative, customer-focused approach, rather than one where a visual designer comes up with pixel-perfect designs. So here's a couple of main advantages. You get better and more honest feedback. It's great for A/B testing. It makes the cost of learning cheap, not expensive. It refines the page flow, not the pages. And it enables you to figure out the interaction design rather than the visual design. So after the design side and as soon as you begin testing, you can look at negative feedback. And one of the most difficult things when it comes to design in solitude is certainly dealing with bad feedback. And no, we don't necessarily mean negative feedback, but feedback doesn't provide us with any direction for our next iteration. Even when this feedback is given with the best intentions, it can be infuriating. And while there are many strategies to hone in on and get specific feedback to alleviate this frustration, sometimes it happens anyway, or it's too late to hone in users and client on a specific detail because they've already seen too much. So what can you do to make bad feedback actionable to complete your project? You can look back at historical feedback, and it's chances that it isn't the first time you've received bad feedback in a project from your users or clients. And it's probably something that you've been dealing with over and over again. But just remember that design and UX is iterative. You don't need to worry. Your users and clients may not really know what they want or have difficulty articulating in ways that make sense to you. So now I'd like to talk about heuristics. Okay, hear what? Some people may not necessarily understand what that term is. But when us creative types get to designing the interface users will eventually use, we don't simply have the ability to weigh every possible outcome or collect every piece of information available for every user and provide a unique bespoke service. So we apply heuristics every day. Most of us do it unconsciously as we all interact with a multitude of websites we visit, the devices we use, and the apps we choose to download. Heuristics can simply be explained as efficient rules which are learned or imprinted on us through repeated use of all those things. So to give you some context into this methodology, I'm going to highlight probably the most recognizable of them all, and that's the hamburger. No, not necessarily a McDonald's, but still, funnily enough, it's relevant to this technique. I'm actually referring to this lovely graphic depicted by 3 short horizontal bars. And as soon as we see this icon, we instinctively know it's where to go to navigate through the app or website on our smartphone or browser. Now, this is the familiarity heuristic, and it's basically a way of assuming that people tend to refer to previous behaviors rather than learning new ones. And of course, familiar things are just plain easier to work with. So to put this to a test, I have a few icons that I'm guessing most of us here would see and instinctively know their use. So I'd like to ask people in the audience to please raise your hands and see if you know them as they come up on the screen. Anyone? Yep.
Comments?
Yep. Yep. Blacktop. Yep. And finally, so now when we design new services, we're therefore able to look at how our associations to icons like these develops, and use that information to assist in the design development of our service, which neatly takes us to one area which is top of the priority list for a lot of new public sector services, and that's accessibility. Now, simplicity for accessibility is a term that I generally use, but it seems to be sort of the in thing over the last year or so, where people just say, just make it simple. But what does simple actually mean? People can always tell when something is simple, uncomplicated, or elegant, or a number of other near synonyms. But most of us can rarely articulate why something is simple and what simple actually is in reference to the problem they're trying to solve. looking back at the personalised registration service for assigning and retaining a registration number, which I was a part of along with a couple of the guys in the room, designing, testing and building something that would normally be associated with something people would instantly suggest as being simple to deliver, such as address lookup with an online service, was anything but simple. Accessibility is at the core of all the digital services today. So simplicity is not just for the average user and a means of saving a few clicks or some time typing. It goes far deeper into just how usable it is for every potential user that may need to use this service, which includes assisted digital or users with special requirements. So working with GDS, we've looked at various options and they've done research and been in contact with people like the Royal National Institute for the Blind, Scope, MenCap, and Dyslexia Action. They all recommend not to build site-specific controls, but instead to promote awareness of browser and OS accessibility settings and keep the actions required by the user to as simple as possible. However, from research that's been done on behalf of GDS by Caroline Jarrett, when they did research for CAP delivery, they actually learned that many people who use the internet regularly don't actually know what a browser is. And never mind how to change it, but that brings real concern that in public services, simple cannot always be simple enough.
Okay. So the importance of doing simple design, collaborative design is so important, especially if you've got multidisciplinary teams. It's good because it stops the UX designer, the UI dev being a complete bottleneck, and if the whole team can contribute to shared design, that does really, really help. So once you've got your prototypes, you've got your tests, you've got Azure, PowerPoint, paper, or working code, the most important thing you've got to do there is regularly get out of the building and go and meet real users. So there's a couple of different ways you can do this. So lab testing is a very effective way. Has anyone been part of a lab testing session? Sort of like a bit like a police interrogation behind the glass. It can be quite fun. It's very valuable. I recommend if you get an opportunity. When we did it on NHS Choices, we took the whole team and sat behind the glass. It meant the whole team actually understood how the users were reacting to the product. The flip side to that is very expensive. You know, you've got to either build your own lab or lab hire, and then you've got the actual cost of taking away the whole team for a day or two. It's not necessarily the most efficient way, but it is very, very effective. The way you address user research, have we got any user researchers in the audience today? Don't play poker with that person. It's an absolute skill. The way that they work with the people and bounce back questions and ask the questions that you need, I'm in awe of user researchers. But it's a team sport. It's very important that either via viewing the user research or if you don't have the opportunity of a lab, that you make sure that you get other team members writing down the insight that you capture from your subjects. So one thing that will become apparent later on, and I'll do an example, is you try and, with a pad of post-it notes, try and capture each individual piece of insight on a separate post-it note so that you can work with that later on. Another technique of user research, if you can't necessarily afford the time or the money for lab testing, is guerrilla testing, which doesn't involve any gorillas or doesn't necessarily always involve going to Starbucks. What guerrilla testing is all about is going to an environment where you can find your users. So when we did the new state pension for DWP, we went to Burnley and Preston libraries, and we got immense feedback for a very emotive topic, and we were getting anger after one sprint through some of the legislative changes that were being made. But that was so important to allow us to focus content editorial people on maybe toning the message down. But actually doing this every single sprint is so important.
So as part of the research plan on personalised registration exemplar, One of the key sources of gaining valuable user feedback on this project was DVLA auctions. Now, these are held every few months in various locations around the UK. So working that into a research plan is relatively simple to do. And it was just amazing how interested and keen people were to see the proposed changes that we were making, but also have a sense of value for themselves in being part of a service that is ultimately being designed around them. We sat down with genuine direct users of the service from both public and commercial side of purchasing personalised registrations. And to have that plan into the research gave us the ability to not only test key new elements of the product, but it enabled us to make strides forwards and continue the build, measure and learn repeat cycle. And as you can see in the corner there, a nice little tweet from Oliver Morley as well.
So once you've done your user research by lab testing or guerrilla testing, particularly if it's guerrilla testing where maybe only a user researcher and one other person went to attend, when you're doing guerrilla testing, you can't take too many people. It might be a bit intimidating, but it's very important to capture and play back. So a little show and tell after every session, or using very cheap products like Silverback, or just videoing from an iPhone with permission from the person. You can get the information and play it back to the people that weren't there. And it gives a fantastic sense of worth and understanding to the development team, particularly to find out some of the challenges the users are having with their system. So once you've done your user research, you can now move to a really important technique called affinity sorting. Another show of hands, who's been involved in affinity sorting before? A few people. So affinity sorting is a very powerful technique. As you can see, it's all about building order from chaos. So you might typically do about 8 interviews a day per person, and it's bringing back all this information around the same topic and trying to get some order out of it. It's a little bit like, what you have to do is a bit like Cynefin. It's a bit of a sense-making process. It's not categorization. There's not always a right answer, but it's all about grouping the insight that you've gathered and try and make some sense from it. So, you group similar observations together. You give it a bit of a theme, and once you've done that, you can start assigning actions. Those actions are effectively hypotheses for your next iteration of delivery. And it's a very effective way of reacting to the correct user feedback. So one of the things that's it's quite difficult to get your head around if you're just talking to people, and it's a technique that we use with our customers quite a lot. So one of the things I like to do before we actually do our first affinity sorting session, or even before we do our first user research session, is I like to get a couple of I like to get the customer involved and run a bit of a generic affinity sorting session, just so they understand that there's not necessarily a right answer, and sometimes it can be quite difficult. So can I have 2 volunteers from the audience, please, to come up and help demonstrate how to do an affinity sorting exercise? Anyone near the front want to come up, please?
Don't be shy.
Come on, someone else? I need 2 people. Go on. So what I'd like you to do, please, sirs, is we've got a number, not everyone can see, particularly at the back, got a number of post-it notes with some user insight, very generic insight. It's words like cucumber, letter, bananas, apples, blueberries, peas. So can you group these, please? So, and can you do a wee note at the top, just what themes have you given those groups? Okay. Brilliant, thank you very much. That's just a very simple exercise to help facilitate a real affinity sorting session. And the thing is, there's no necessary right answer. It just gets people thinking of how we can start sense-making this information. It's not always fruit and veg. Some people, I find, do colours. Yeah, that's something that's quite common as well. We also had one team of quite portly gentlemen actually sorted pie fillings and not suitable for pie fillings. So there's not necessarily a right answer, but it's all about making sure that you just get an understanding of what you want to do when you actually come to the affinity sorting session. And it's all about it's focusing the insight and giving some themes and allowing you to move to the next iteration and build some actions for how you're going to progress. And similarly to the assumption mapping, once you've got your actions of what you want to do next, what you've done is you've built your backlog for the next iteration. Either through sort of high volumes of quantitative sort of feedback where a lot of the input is coming back the same, or through techniques such as dot voting, you're able to prioritize the backlog of hypotheses of what you want to do next. And it sort of brings it all together. So using, this is NHS Choices, where we did 4 one-week iterations. We started with some assumptions and built some initial hypotheses prototypes, 4 quick iterations where there was 2 days user research, 3 days building prototype. What we were able to find is we got increased learning and confidence of what we were doing was the right thing. And as we did that, we were actually building more and more higher fidelity prototypes. And at the end, we actually had a working, usable system. So just to recap on NHS Choices, this is what it looked like at the beginning. We had a lot of assumptions in the top right-hand quadrant, and after 4 one-week sprints, we were able to actually use the tests to gather certainty about a lot of the features, a lot of the assumptions, but also we were able to understand that not everything was that important straight away. And from this particular point, this was a discovery, we're able to then use story mapping techniques to build a backlog to deliver an alpha. So this was a really powerful technique that we revisited throughout the discovery. Checking time. So the cadence on this one, it knackered us a little bit. I don't recommend doing it for a long duration. It was all about the user research, and the UX was at the heart of the delivery. 2 days user research prototyping, making sure that at the end of each user research session, easy for me to say, we went straight into affinity sorting and sprint planning, and then the pub, because it was a very, very tough day. And you do the show and tell to the wider stakeholder audiences later on. So that was a discovery project. The next one is carer's allowance. So this is a diagram written by one of my colleagues. I think at this point they were probably in sprint 50. So it's very important to understand that this is a live service. They're delivering working software at this point on a weekly cycle. Live code into production every week, but user research was still at the heart of the delivery cadence. The user research output fed into every sprint planning session and actually drove what the developers were doing. And what we also had to do was fit in the rigor of software engineering around continuous operational acceptance testing of security, performance, accessibility, and field acceptance tests. So 2 very different projects at different phases, but very similar approach to making sure that lean UX and user research is absolutely at the heart of delivery. So to recap, it's all about build, measure, learn. That's quite common, a lot of people know that, but I think it's very important that you also have to pause, reflect, and decide properly. And some of the techniques you've got, so when you build stuff, building hypotheses is really valuable. They might just be, a couple of different variations of a question on a piece of paper. You're building prototypes of varying fidelity. You measure that by doing your user research, which is so important, and you learn by either taking the whole team with you or using team playback sessions, show and tells, presenting back your findings. You reflect on what you've learned by using affinity sorting to structure this, get the whole team involved, get the customer involved, and it really helps you understand what you learned in that particular user research session, and it helps drive out where to go next. And from there you can use a number of techniques to help you prioritize the backlog. So that's us coming to the end of our presentation. Hopefully we've tried our best to meet our criteria of explaining UX, assumption mapping, collaborative design, user research and affinity sorting. Does anyone disagree? So any questions around any of those topics?
Do you find it easy to get access to the end users? Because a lot of clients I've worked for will go through some of this process, but
Yeah.
the UI will be validated by the main expert and the client.
So that's a very good question, and I think that the key thing for that one is you've got to be very creative and understand who your users are. So there's no single right answer. So on carers allowance, we were fortunate where we built a partnership with local carers charities and national carers charities, and they actually sourced the people we needed. I think Clifton had a captive audience at the car auctions, so as long as you know where to go and do your guerrilla testing and really understand your users. For NHS choices, it was quite difficult. We actually hired an agency to find parents whose children actually had chickenpox at that moment. So that was a very sort of niche cohort, but it was so important that we learned from that. Because the learning from chickenpox, it allowed us to work on other symptoms, emotive conditions that were affecting the rest of the site. So yeah, it's just be creative, and when we also did an alpha for NHS 111 Digital, which has just passed its alpha assessment. What we did there was we actually did go to places like Starbucks, but we took away all the NHS branding. We created a false American brand, so just in case we met a Daily Mail reporter, and we got people to give us their honest feedback on that. So yeah, just get out of the building is the main thing. Any other questions? Ollie?
So, when you're doing user research, you're speaking to individuals, and sometimes it's a clear-cut thing that you prove that hypothesis. But how do you know when you've got enough confidence that that's proven and you won't disprove it through testing?
Yeah, that's always a challenge, and what we find is that's something that you is easier to facilitate if you've got as many of the team in the room when you're doing your affinity sorting and prioritizing the backlog. So from that particular point, you can actually say, it helps if you're doing the discovery alpha beta phase as well. So for discovery, you need to learn just enough. So that there's a bit of rigor, there's a bit of, you could do analysis paralysis and keep going forward. But you've got a finite window. You know that you've got to get through as much as you can. So it's important when you've got an idea, sometimes you have to park it with confidence or an element of risk that you can pick this up in the alpha when you start building it for real. So I think the key thing is no one's ever complacent that everything is bang nailed on, and you don't iterate to perfection. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much. Cheers.